Washington Monument, Washington, D.C., Washington College and University, Washington apples from Washington State, Washington's famous, George Washington's great. Thank you to my friend Brenda Learer from the 6th grade for teaching me that awesome little song. I still remember it, and 6th grade was a long time ago. There's nothing like an improvisational a cappella patriotic ditty for a walk down memory lane on 4th of July. Happy 4th to everybody. This is Talk Hidden Values, and I am here to celebrate our last day of the Liberty Vigil for 2020. Welcome to the Summer of George. You've already heard the little homage to our first president, George Washington, of whom I'm a big fan. And some of you will recall George Costanza from Seinfeld, specifically the episode in which he declares that it's going to be the summer of George. He has grand ambitions for all these things he's going to do. He's going to get in shape, he's going to read books, he's going to learn languages or whatever, all the things that he's going to accomplish. So here we sit at the height of summer. We're 2 weeks past the solstice, right, which is the day when we have the most light in the 24-hour period. It is hotter than blazes here in the center square. We're a couple days into a run of 90-degree heat. My window's closed. You won't hear any of my woodland critters because I finally had to turn on the AC. And so here we are in the height of the true Summer of George, 20 years after George Costanza declared it. We finally arrived at the Summer of George. The beginning of the summer is marked by another patriotic holiday, Memorial Day, which has come to be mostly all of the people that we remember that have gone before us, but especially all of the folks who have fought on behalf of our freedom, our country. And certainly the origin of it, and it still is at the core of it. And this year, we started off that way on Memorial Day, but by the end of Memorial Day, we had a really dark turn in that story because George Floyd had been brutally murdered by a police officer while everyone watched. Other police officers watched and civilians on the street watched, and someone had a camera and they filmed this for almost 9 minutes while this person's life was ended despite his pleas. And it was extremely strange. It was at least as bizarre as it was brutal, and I still wonder what the rest of that story is and what remains to be told. But whatever else it was brutal and horrible, and the world reacted accordingly. Everyone saw what a nightmare that was. And pretty soon after that, our world became a nightmare. I've kind of come to think of George Floyd as the Archduke George, because for those of you that are history buffs, or even if you're not, go Google it. At the beginning of World War I World War I began with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. And it seemed like just an incident. It was a kind of an important incident, but it didn't appear that it would necessarily be connected to a worldwide conflagration. But it was because of the way that events had arranged themselves throughout Europe. The way the dominoes were all set up, that was the first domino that then just caused this whole pattern of things to tip over. And I feel like, at least with our Summer of George, that's kind of how this brutal murder of George Floyd has turned out to be. It turned out that his murder was kind of like the Archduke Ferdinand. It was the beginning of all of these things that have continued to unravel since that time. As our elected leaders were trying to wrap their minds around this idea that there's tons of racial police brutality in the country, as they're being told this by emerging forming mobs. And some of us were wondering if this police brutality was necessarily connected to race. Maybe, maybe not. There are all these other complaints against this police officer, and I still don't know what's in those complaints. Maybe they're mostly racial complaints, and maybe they're not, and there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in that regard. And all of a sudden, a lot of other incidents besides the George Floyd incident got lumped in with that one. And it has made things very hard to parse apart. But that didn't matter to the mobs of people, because the agenda of the anarcho-statist tyrants is to move that into the narrative of racism writ large in the culture. And they did it very quickly. Within the week, there was all kinds of guilty soul searching and all kinds of coerced confessions. And we had kneeling and chanting and all kinds of truly bizarre images that we were watching and things we were hearing. And of course, all of that was followed by outrage from people that thought it was bizarre and really distressing and disturbing that our culture was being fragmented in that way, and that this man's death was being used in that way too, I think was troubling. In fact, one young man that I thought was pretty funny was out filming. So it sounded like he was a young black man, was the impression that I got. And although we didn't see him in the film, I didn't. And he was interviewing these two young white women who were down on their knees, and he was asking them how they felt about the brutal murder of George Foreman, which, I know sent a lot of fight fans and a lot of, chefs into their kitchens kind of in a panic. So it was really funny just to observe. I think that he was making fun of them and the fact that they don't know the difference between George Foreman and George Floyd. I'm assuming that he actually does know the difference. I'm hoping that that's true, please God. So we moved then from this idea that racism is writ large in our culture, then became, as Juneteenth approached, the idea that racism is writ large in our history, which tied back into the 1619 Project and all the ways we have to fix our history. And there was a lot of outcry, of course, from folks who said they've never heard of Juneteenth, which I thought was a little strange. I mean, I've had more contact, maybe, than a lot of folks I know with majority black communities, but I will say that I've never seen Juneteenth done up like it's been done up in the summer of George here in 2020, even within majority black communities. But certainly there are a lot of folks of every skin color that are understanding Juneteenth in a new way, shall we say. And so as we moved into this phase of our Summer of George, we began to look at racism writ in our history. And we had statue toppling and the effort to rewrite our history. And then again, our elected officials were just trying to keep up, right? And so they started off by letting people blow off steam, and then they went to posturing, and then they went to actually doing some meaningful things to stop the chaos. And then they decided to legalize the chaos, and they began actually removing some statues and historical items, up to and including apparently the statue of Christopher Columbus in Columbus, Ohio, which is in my home state and my state where I live now. And there's been a whole thing in the last week about renaming the city, and it has something to do with Chef Boyardee and a chef on television that thinks something to do with renaming should reflect our coping during the pandemic. It is utterly beyond me, and it sounds absolutely insane. The more people try to explain it, the crazier it sounds. So I hereby call on our governor, Mike DeWine, to just put Christopher Columbus in the basement for safekeeping, and once all of this is over, then bring him back up. Right? This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. So anyway, we've moved in the last week to paying more attention to something that's been going on since the beginning of this, and since even before the beginning of the Summer of George, which is racism writ big business, right? So we have all of these guilty statements and a lot of pressure coming on business to make the guilty statements. And to, the more I'm PC enough and I'm more woke than thou, and a lot of posturing around that on the part of businesses. And in an effort to kind of illustrate that, by the time I was kind of putting this together, the Summer of George, I had this kind of great theme. So I went online and consulted who else? Google, which is, definitely more woke than thou. They're more woke than I am anyway. And I thought, well, they'll have all kinds of big business people and their woke statements, and they did, but they didn't have any Georges in big business. So I thought, well, it'd be kind of nice to have a woke poster child that's a George, for the Summer of George. So they didn't. So if anybody has a woke poster child named George for me, that would be great. I'm open to your suggestions. Leave a comment. What I did find, so it's kind of, I think the woke PC business culture is sort of the summer of the un-George, right? Like Very Merry Unbirthday from Alice in Wonderland. We have the big business un-George because it's everyone. You don't have to be a George to be submitting your woke credentials in the business world. The one thing I did find, which reminded me of something I'd omitted, was George Lopez, right? Comedy is certainly big business, and George Lopez certainly qualifies as big comedy. So, and comedy was probably one of the areas that's been the most affected by woke culture from the earliest on, partly because they're some of the biggest offenders on the PC scale, right? And so years ago, Jerry Seinfeld, speaking of a thematic tie-in, came out and said he couldn't play college campuses anymore. He couldn't go to college campuses and do anything funny because there was no sense of humor. Well, lo and behold, all the folks that years ago were on college campuses are now out in the world making life crazy because they still don't have a sense of humor. So George Lopez, who is pretty well known for his racial stereotype observations, which I don't consider racist humor. I think it's an important distinction we're missing. Saying to be racist is to believe that one race is superior to another race on the basis of your race. To engage in racial humor typically is to advance or observe stereotypes that tend to apply to people of different races, that are people that are different from each other, which can be funny if you have a sense of humor about that. And that is what George Lopez has tended to do in my experience of seeing him. Which is mostly on a show where he plays a Mexican who's married to a Cuban. And they each have a parent who is much more traditional and old world. And so the family dynamics play in between Mexicans and Cubans, not just with the white culture. And so it's particularly amusing to somebody who's a Hispanophile, as I am. So, but he's decided that he's had some incidents and things that are just really unfunny, and he's kind of trying to walk that back. And of course, the headline in the Daily Beast was, "Is it too little, too late?" And I think the general consensus is going to be that everything is going to be too little, too late, no matter what it is. And so I think that our poor George of big comedy is probably playing a losing game. And I think the sooner that we quit playing these things as a game, the better off we're going to be. I think that we need to stand up for actual incidents of real racism. And I think we also need to stand up against false claims that are being advanced by an agenda. And I think that if we do both of those things, we're more likely to be taken seriously. And unfortunately, too many people do one or the other and don't actually do both. I think we also need to protect and preserve our history in the best way that we understand it. And that means that we need to actually acknowledge the dark chapters of our history, but without having the impression that all there is darkness, which is completely ludicrous. And I think we need to resist the tendency for that rewriting to occur. I think we also need to remember that history is what it is, and no matter how we write it, it's not going to change the reality of what happened. And the downstream effects are going to be what they are, no matter how much we try to, pardon the term, whitewash our history, nor how much we try to make it a dark image because it suits our narrative. That the effects of that, as we are living with them, is really what we need to be addressing in terms of having compassion for all the people in our country. I also think that when we look at business, that our best bet is going to be to vote with our pocketbook and to actually make an effort to patronize businesses that are like-minded to us. Certainly, folks who buy into the woke narrative are going to be shopping at woke businesses, and they're going to be not using the services of people who do not make their wokeness clear enough. And our alternative, if we think differently, is to compile a list, maintain a community of folks who think differently and who want to patronize businesses that are not going to buy into that. So that's one part of what I would like to do here. I want to invite all of you to go to the discussion page of this channel. It's what YouTube has switched out for what used to be the community page. And I have a statement there about this channel and what the work of this channel is going to encompass. And part of that is going to be to build a community of like-minded folks, to include businesses that we will be able to patronize to get basic needs met, which we are going to need to do if we're going to attempt not to be caught in the woke trap. So here we are at the zenith of the summer, 4th of July. The current president just met out at Mount Rushmore with a bunch of our other presidents, George Washington among them, Abe and TR and Thomas. What's going to happen by the end of the summer of George? Before we arrive at the typical close, which is Labor Day, all of those regular folks that work for a living, if they're allowed to work. If your name's George and you work for a living, let me know. Let me know on the chat board I was talking about. Beginning of the school year. If you're going back to school and your name is George, let me know. You're going to be in school, you're going to be online, you're going to be at school at home, going to school from home. We also have, when we get to the end of the summer, the beginning of the church year. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, it starts on the 1st of September. And a couple of days before that, the feast day that we observe is on the 29th of August, is all Orthodox soldiers killed in battle. We have a lot of our saints are soldiers. And our most famous soldier saint, who was not killed in battle, but he has a great story. Guess what his name is? St. George. He's super famous. He's a really big saint. Lots and lots of churches named after him. And his best known event of his life, whether it's a real event or a mythic event, is kind of up for debate. It was a really long time ago. People aren't really sure. But he's best known for slaying a dragon. And that's how he's pictured in his iconography. In most of the icons, he's seen slaying a dragon. So that's my hope for us for the rest of the summer. May we be inspired by our American founder, George Washington. Hear, hear. May we remember the struggles of George Floyd and other people like him. People who are mistreated, people who are brutalized, people who have died unjustly, and people who struggle in their own lives with addiction. He was struggling. People who are hurting. May we remember them, reach out to them, defend them, and stand up for them. And may we also stand up for them in ways that disallow others from using them for their personal agendas. And ultimately, may we go forth to slay the dragon of tyranny that threatens the Republic in a day. Happy 4th, everybody. I will see you in a few days. I'm going to take a few days off. Go back and listen to episodes of this you might have missed, or check out the Attachment and Society videos, because that's where we need to go next. A lot of the issues we're dealing with are directly related to the fact that we lack strong, healthy attachments in our relationship. So I wish you a great holiday, and I pray you will have a good, safe week, and I will talk with you soon. Thank you. Like, share, subscribe, etc. And comment. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye.